Hello everyone, welcome to the week 4 lecture for EMS207 2025-30 session. So this should be a fairly quick one this week. I just want to recap some of the kind of core theories of teaching and learning in science education to sort of consolidate the themes that were implicit in the syllabus that we unpacked in week 2 and the unit planning, the 5 E's frameworks from week 3. So I guess this is a bit of a consolidation week in a sense, and in the next 2 weeks, weeks 5 and 6, really in that sort of move into the preparation for assessment 1, we're going to move into teaching strategies more explicitly and assessment practices, but clearly that understanding of the principles and the theory is quite important. So it should be reasonably short, but definitely tune in for the next 2 because they will have more practical information for your assessment tasks. And you can skip ahead to those because they should all be released at around the same time anyway. So we're going to go through some theories of learning and the implications for practice as best as I can explain them to you, and we will talk about some preparation for tutorials. We're particularly interested in these working scientifically in design and production skills. That was a real focus for the last round of NISA accreditation in the subject. They are on page 26 of the syllabus, I believe. So let's go through some ideas and concepts about what we know about learning in a general sense. How this plays out in practice varies from class to class, obviously. But we need to establish some kind of clear baseline parameters. There is great variety in learning styles or learning preferences, I prefer to say. Engagement preferences is a term I prefer. Attention spans, memory, developmental paces and things like that. I don't like a fixed view of intelligence necessarily. I think it's best to have a growth mindset in education and to be working with the assumption that all students are capable of learning. That's not to say that they will all reach the same levels or achieve the same things ultimately, but they're all capable of growth. So, long story short, there's great variance in the many small humans that will sit in front of you, stand in front of you, talk to you throughout your career. And as the constructivist idea suggests, we have to respond to their understandings, their beliefs, their interests as best we can, and to link those to the syllabus outcomes. And that's the great tension. We can't just wander off into what they're interested in, but we have to incorporate what they're interested in to some extent. So there's all these little tensions that we have to move through as educators. The effect of this, of course, as the second point suggests, is that we cannot teach everybody in the same way. And in fact, even if you have the same class, how people respond and students respond to different approaches, different content can vary from within the day, within the tutorial, within the lesson. So we are always seeking input, we're seeking data, we're critically evaluating our practice, we're working with our students to adjust the framework. It's the sport metaphor. You have a game plan, but you adjust it as things happen. I do think sport is quite a good analogy in some respects. We know that motivation, effort, and self-esteem affect learning and performance. Whether someone is achieving well, achieving poorly, achieving to standard, their achievement is definitely impacted by all these sort of self-efficacy, self-esteem ideas. Students can have low effort. I was certainly a low effort student at different points. I mean, sometimes I'm a low effort student at some points as well. So essentially humans are up and down. And how they feel, how that chemical composition in the brain is responding at that point in time does dictate how effective learning might be. I mean, it's true to say that suffering from any form of anxiety or depression makes you a less effective learner at that point in time. Huge life changes can affect learning as well. You would know as learners, you are bringing things into those tutorials, into those online sessions, into those assessment tasks that are distracting from your learning, and that's okay. That's a normal part of the process. So knowing our learners is quite important. We have to, learning is to enhance their lives. It shouldn't come at the cost of their lives, I guess is what we'd say. Of course, to this idea, learning style preferences, cultural backgrounds are a big part of this. It's not to say you choose one or the other, but there can be aspects of group learning. Individual learning is an important part of this. We incorporate cultural backgrounds, we respond to cultural backgrounds. Sometimes we do that implicitly. Certainly, as a regional Australian man, certain ways that I present myself generally go quite well in Australia. Self-deprecating humour being one that certainly wouldn't work quite as well, perhaps in the American context. for example. I know in my experience with some American academics years back, they felt that the self-deprecating humour was self-defeating. So these are complex things. There's no way to be good at it all the time, and you're dependent upon your context. You're a product of your context and culture as well. So we just want to be aware of that. We cannot assume neutrality in this entire process. And I think the big one that I like to point to is that learning is non-linear. Students respond differently. They complete things at different speeds. Sometimes they take a long time. Sometimes they take a little time. Sometimes they're not engaged. Sometimes it's too easy, too hard. We're constantly balancing this. And really, subjects like this are designed to give you a suite of options that you might deploy in a classroom setting. How you deploy them and the decisions that you make are refined through practice, ultimately. So we're just building up that toolkit, ultimately, and your thought processes with this. So long story short, students are not blank slates. Tabula rasa is the term we would use if we were speaking Latin, that they're not coming in as blank slates. They've got their own opinions, they've got thoughts about you, thoughts about the people next to them, and want to incorporate that into the process through a constructivist mode of teaching. This is not to say students discover everything by themselves. It is to say that the teacher is a facilitator of learning, and their role in that process can be providing information, aiding discovery, working together, that we're flexible. We're not just lecturing at students and saying, tell me what I told you. That is not a pathway to deep learning. It may help you gain a test, but it won't lead to the deep learning required to be an effective, scientifically literate citizen. So from this, we have a few ideas. We know that successful learning involves numerous strategies. Hopefully by this point you've seen this in tutorials. I know in the Bathurst campus I sometimes scrap entire activities and move on to the other stuff. Sometimes I allow students, higher education students, to take different pathways and make choices and negotiate. And that can be done in the primary school as well. I've seen it. Things like contract learning, where students go, I'd like to spend time on this thing and then this thing, as opposed to follow me through. So there are all sorts of things. And of course, at times you can go back to traditional learning. You still might need a silent test and a worksheet and those sorts of things as well. There's a flow to it, I guess is what I would say. And you make decisions in the moment, that you move from student-centred to teacher-centred. You respond to those students. Sometimes you scrap things. Sometimes you don't have the resources to do it the way you want to, so you do it the best you can. Learning is a process of creating personal meaning from new information by tying it to prior experience. That's why you constantly hear me making probably sports metaphors and really abstract economic metaphors from the 1980s. That's me using creating content representations from my lived experience. You will do the same thing. And we get that personal meaning in this subject through your assessment tasks. Your students will show that personal meaning through their assessment tasks. So it's not a case of giving the correct information. We know information does not exist outside the mind of a thinking being. So it's slightly different. It's a slight change. I don't know if you've ever read your assessment tasks out to parents or partners or anyone else. My brother used to do this when he was studying law. He would give sort of pseudo-law lectures to my mum, which she quite enjoyed, because that was him creating personal meaning. You know, teaching something is a great way of enhancing your own understanding. So the old adage, those who can't do teach, is generally one of the probably most incorrect, old myths. The transfer of learning occurs if students receive support through scaffolding and bridging. So that movement from the teacher doing something and the student doing something is not just a skip, a pause, from one to the other. That you move through scaffolding, because if they don't need support, they're not really learning. They're consolidating, they're practicing, they're doing something they're already comfortable with. So the notion here is scaffolding and bridging, the idea of templates, asking questions of teachers, word banks, those little support systems that are in place. I mean, they're in this subject, for example, with templates. There when the students are operating in their zone of proximal development, meaning they are capable of doing the task with support. So it is appropriately difficult. If they are capable of doing the task without support, they are treading old ground. They're not growing. They're, practicing, reinforcing. There's still room for that, of course. And if they can't do the work with any independence, it's too difficult. So we're always looking for that zone of proximal development, and operating within that as a student and as a teacher is the sweet spot. That's where you feel like you've achieved something. I'm hoping that you've experienced moments of that in this subject and others at university, and certainly experienced it earlier on in your education as well. So, as we know, teaching and assessment are integrated, completely integrated. We have diagnostic, formative, summative assessment. Things are always happening. Data are being collected. You're observing, you're asking questions, you're collecting work samples. It's not just that big test at the end, because that is giving us information as to whether they're creating knowledge, whether they're in the zone of proximal development, whether it's too easy, whether it's too hard, whether it doesn't make sense. And so it's constantly happening, and we're moving away from this idea of assessment being that one shot. You know, it's not just the HSC, it's not just NAPLAN, it's not just TIMS or PISA. In fact, those types of assessments are the least useful for typical classroom practice, for growth on a day-to-day, week-to-week, term-to-term basis, because they lack ecological validity. They are not products of that environment. Anyway, we'll save some of that for the week 6 lecture. And of course, learning frequently occurs as a result of social interaction. This is not to say you can't read stuff and work independently, but there is a cycle where things need to be consolidated through some form of social interaction. Could be with your teacher, could be with other students, could be with those around you. Testing ideas, framing it in your own words and language. And social interaction can be writing. It doesn't have to be verbal. You know, a former honours student of mine has been doing work on written argumentation and debate. So the idea of some form of communication to others, having meaning, is a part of this process, and it always probably will be. So let's look at some definitions. Let's put this on the page for a second here and think about what this means in science. Because if we don't kind of interrogate these ideas, you may find yourself inherently falling into an older model of education. I know a lot of people think, well, the teacher teaches what's in their head, and the students get that, and they know what the teacher knows, and off you go. If you ask a person outside of education, that would be implicitly their understanding if they never interrogated it any further than that. So here are a few ideas. Little chart here. SO means no science beliefs. None at all. Unlikely in some respects. Who, even in kindergarten, is coming into your classroom with no sense of the world around them, no beliefs, no observations about what they're seeing, no culture, no stories that have informed their thinking. And anyone that's got, I've got kids, they're always generating ideas about the world around them. Sometimes they're correct, sometimes they're incorrect, but they're doing it nonetheless because the brain is seeking to make patterns, make sense of the world around it. Teachers, we have the science teachers' belief, the teachers' science beliefs and understandings. And these are not perfect. They're never really perfect. Mine aren't perfect. Yours won't be perfect. The stories back in the day I've heard of science teachers who discovered they were teaching alternative conceptions for 20 years. And that's not a knock on any particular science teacher. That's the human condition. Science changes under our feet sometimes as well. For example, the science of plate tectonics. You know, the notion there are these huge plates of Earth that move and they grind together and they create earthquakes, volcanoes, even tornadoes and things like that along the San Andreas Fault. That wasn't settled, established science till the 1970s. So my parents, who are not elderly, would not have gained that in their science understanding. In their science education. That's why we need people to be scientifically literate, to keep pace reasonably with what's out there. We have the children's scientific beliefs. Again, I don't think they're walking with zero. They've got their own beliefs too. Some of them may be non-scientific beliefs, and we've got to work through those as well, respectfully. And of course, we've got the current beliefs of the scientific community. Now, look, in some places there is consensus. Some places there's tension in the scientific community. It's a complex space to operate. No one is expecting a teacher to be perfect here, but we will attempt to engage. We will not go off gut feeling and tradition. We will try to engage as best we can through sources that are accessible to us as regular folk to help the scientific community. That's what I like to think of us as. People that are at the gate trying to bring people over the bridge to meet the scientists and those sorts of things. And that's really important work because the scientific community can do nothing, can influence no positive change in society if the general population of non-scientists, of which you are, if you're listening to this, you, as a teacher, you're probably not that, or you may have been in the past. We need people to come along with the scientific community or nothing happens. So those are some of the definitions. So we've got this classic view. The classic view that was implicit in the old model of teaching. We still see the old model of teaching from time to time. I like to think of my mum's experiences at a small school in regional Australia. It would have been the 1960s. And the idea was you The teacher would write notes and lecture at the front on a chalkboard. The students would be expected to sit quietly and take notes. And heaven help you if you acted out of line or tried to speak or talk or anything like that, because you got caned. You got smacked over the hands with a ruler. That idea. I mean, your parents might be a bit young. I'm a bit older than you guys, more than a bit. Implicit in that model, and I don't think this is an explicit thing, I think it was more about behaviour and control and desirable behaviours, children being seen, not heard. But implicit in that model, if we undertake it, is that the children have nothing of value to bring to it. They're blank slates, empty vessels to be filled up with knowledge. And so we have the zero child has no knowledge, that it just gets poured in by the teacher, and then they know what the teacher knows. Fantastic. We do a bit of teaching and learning, and then they're just clones of you. How likely is that for a 6-year-old if you were a 20-something, 30-something, or 40-something? Developmentally, pretty unlikely that they will walk out of any experience knowing exactly what you know. And that's okay. Right? They're not expected to get that. As science teachers, in a moment in time, we're links in the chain. We're not responsible for the entire education system quality. We're one. One link in the chain, moving them on to the next teacher, to the next teacher, to the next teacher, and hopefully keeping them in that pipeline. There's also a belief in this that the teacher somehow knows the scientific truth. They just know it. And look, I'm sure, there are plenty of fantastic science teachers who are very bloody close to knowing the entirety of all the content. And there are some that are far off. A lot of us primary folks have more gaps than the secondary science specialists, and that's okay too. But we have to ask ourselves, is it realistic to think that the teacher has a completely accurate worldview? Pretty unlikely. Because we're products of our time, what you miss, the weird little things that teachers tell you that are untrue. We're products of a mixture of accurate and inaccurate information about basically everything. So if we take that idea of the teachers and students not having perfect worldviews, it moves us towards constructivism. How likely is that scenario? Was your head empty? Did you walk into science lessons and things having a neutral feeling and no prior knowledge or beliefs? Probably not. Pretty unlikely. And as a young student, you probably want to share those beliefs and ideas, things you've seen. If you've worked with really young children, they want to share with you the random observations they have. So this is the old model. Probably not appropriate in my view. Then there's the next one. A little bit better. The only difference here is we acknowledge, actually, no, they're not zero. They've got their own beliefs. Great. You've seen this. You think that the extra heating caused by the changes in summer is caused by the Earth's distance from the sun, because it's like a heater. You probably believe that. I believe that. Well into my, when I started uni, I believed that. So we do have prior beliefs and notions that we bring to things. This model, though, is pretty shallow. We say, yeah, you believe some stuff. It's wrong. Here's the real stuff. And it's the teacher's stuff, and the teacher's stuff's perfect. So it's a step above, but it's shallow. And it's this notion that, okay, here's your silly ideas. Let's just replace them with the correct ideas. Let's override them. This is called the teacher dominance model. And it's a little bit more common. I don't think any teacher in the modern era is walking around going, here's a couple of blank slates. So everyone will acknowledge kids are bringing stuff to the classroom. But then they acknowledge that. They might even do a bit of diagnostic assessment, and then they just file that away and they go as they were going to go. How likely is it? Have you seen this? You probably have at different points. Do you believe everything your teacher told you? Some do, some don't. Do you think you always got taught the right stuff? Did teachers contradict each other? Sometimes they did. I saw it in real life sometimes. I saw English teachers try to lecture over science teachers in science classrooms. It was wacky stuff. Again, better than the previous one, but again, a little bit tokenistic. So these are called the traditional models, where they're the transmissive models, where the teacher goes out and talks at you and says, here's the knowledge, and you're going to give that back to me. It inherently leads to low-level forms of assessment, low cognitive levels like multiple choice, like note-taking and those sorts of things. And they do not work for the majority of students. And they do not prepare students, even if they are successful in that model, for the type of learning and engagement that is required when they exit your classroom, when they go into higher education, into professions, into jobs, into careers, and as citizens. So even if they can do this well, they can game the system, they can do well in the tests. Why? To what end is that being achieved? What are you preparing them for in that model? What we do know is that the beliefs of the learner are actually quite important. What they believe about the class, what they think they know, what they don't know, various traumas that students have that bring into it. I mean, I remember teaching a class, a small school class, and one young fellow, I said, we're doing a science lesson. We're going to do, I was pretty excited, as you can imagine. He screamed, no F science. I remember we had to leave the classroom because he was threatening to throw a glass container at the other students. I didn't know what I was walking into. I thought, oh my God, this is the first time I've taught this student. We eventually got there. We worked around, I had to do some work, had to take on board what he'd experienced of science, had to show him how I was changing things, how I was adapting to his needs, respecting his beliefs and insights, and he ended up sharing cultural stories with me. He ended up being one of the first to answer questions. He contributed to class discussions so that he could contribute without having his written language being a barrier. So we did a bunch of things, and he eventually grew to like science. But there was a lot of prior trauma with science that he'd come to see. He'd come to see it's part of his own failings as a learner. It was quite depressing, really. It was very emotionally, quite powerful stuff emotionally to deal with. But anyway, let's move on to the constructivist model. As accidentally a nice pivot there, because that's where I went with this. So the role of the learner is actually really important. They're the ones doing stuff. They're the ones doing assessment tasks, showing their knowledge. That's what it's all about. It's true in this subject. I can give this lecture 1,000 times. I can tweak it. I can do it slightly better. But all that really matters in this is what you do as a pre-service teacher in the assessment task. So why would I be the dominant figure here? Doesn't make any sense. I've got my degree. I'm qualified. I can't become qualified again. So it applies to you guys in the same way it applies to your students. They're the centre of all of this. They're the ones that need to do stuff. So of course we should engage in the constructivist model. Again, as I said, knowledge doesn't exist outside the mind of a thinking being. Very philosophical, but undeniably true. In other words, the learner makes meaning for him or herself. We have our own language, our own framing, things that don't quite make sense to us, things that are quite fuzzy. It is not just a download, here's the information component. It fits into our worldview, our previous biases, the way we like to talk and think and write and those sorts of things. So the mind is not empty, and when we experience something, it interacts with what is already there. Your experience of this subject is defined by your previous educational experiences, other tutors, other high school experiences, all those sorts of things. Things that have been positive, neutral, negative, whatever you say. So each of us creates mental models of the world around us. Sometimes they're called heuristics, mental shortcuts. We have patterns in how we drive our cars. We have shortcuts around forms that we fill in. We do all these sorts of things. We make sense of the world around us. We observe patterns. We see this beginning in infancy, and we're doing it all the time because it makes life easy. If you had to attend to all the data available to you all the time, as an adult, your brain would overload itself. And as you become older and you experience things repeatedly and you get patterns, they start to become routine. And we have mental models. Have you ever driven home, driving home, you've been there heaps and heaps of times and you forget the trip, you're like, how did I get here? You almost go on autopilot. It's that notion. So these extend to science as well. So the classic one we see is the geocentric view of the world, that the sun moves around the earth, that the earth is the centre of the universe. You can understand why someone would believe this. If you're standing on earth, it doesn't feel like it's moving. It feels still. And sometimes it feels like it's moving if you've been on the grog, but generally it feels like it's still, but it's the sun that seems to be moving. So there's logic to this. The seasons are caused by the Earth's changing distance from the sun. Well, it's closer in summer, so it's hotter. We're further away in winter, and perhaps that suggests like an elliptical orbit around the sun. Problem there is there would not be different seasons in the different hemispheres if that were the case. So the question becomes, why would it be winter in the northern hemisphere and summer in the southern hemisphere? Suddenly that model doesn't make any sense. Some of you listening might go, hang on, you're right, never thought of it that way. Fair enough. If an object is not moving, there is no force acting upon it. Now, If it's not moving here, gravity's playing some sort of role there, we can assume. And one of my favourites is that lightning is alive because it seems to be moving and growing, and fire too. So there's this sort of miscategorization stuff as well. The thing is, even after teaching, we can still have the wrong idea, so we can get part of this. So for example, I might say, teach students that is actually the angle between the sun and the Earth that causes more focused and intense sunlight. So we know that the Earth's on a 23.4 degree tilt. So when we're in summer in the southern hemisphere, it is our hemisphere that seems to be tilted toward the sun. This doesn't change the distance, but it means more sun is going to a smaller area. So the Earth is being heated on a per metre basis more strongly in summer. That's why you see in summer the sun appears higher in the sky. It's more direct stuff. And you can do this with things. You can play around with the idea like a magnifying glass. Have you ever burnt paper with a magnifying glass? Same amount of sun, but it's being focused on a smaller area, so of course it is hotter. Now, a student can internalise some beliefs there and say, oh, well, the Earth is tilted. I've seen this model play out. But it's that tilting that changes the distance. So they can end up with mixed models. And that's part of the journey, in my view. So these things interact, but they don't, as I just described with that example, they do not always lead to a perfectly accurate scientific understanding. So there are a few configurations we can have here, different impacts of learning. So we can say, okay, science, we mix together the child's learning and the teacher's learning, stuff happens, and then they walk away with no change whatsoever in what they believe. I mean, this would just be straight up considered ineffective teaching. Maybe you've given out a worksheet and played a video. They're not paying any attention to what you're doing. You're not checking in. You're not actively part of the process. They're bored. They're switched off. Nothing happens. I'm not judging. It happens it happens from time to time. Jeez, it's happened in my tutorials. That's just the nature of it. But it's what we do with the no effect scenario. If we don't adapt practice, that's when it becomes effectively teaching malpractice. You can then end up with the public and private model as well. This is a tricky one, where the students are adept enough to go, I'll tell you what you want to hear. But in my mind, it's still the distance, because the heater is hotter to me the closer I am to it. So they publicly tell you what you want to hear, and they repeat that back, but they don't change their beliefs. There's no transformation of ideas. This can become a classroom that's perhaps not got that respect. The ideas, it's one of those first two models where you assume the student is a blank slate, or you go, hey, your views are cool, but we're doing mine now. This can be different epistemological beliefs, where you can have religious views and scientific views being at odds with one another. Although my approach to this is literally dealing with that epistemological stuff head on and saying these are different ways of thinking. They are not compatible, but they are not attacking one another. That's my view. So we take one and we say these two things don't need to go together and attack each other in one setting. We put them to the side. But you may have a different approach on that. Let's talk about it in tutorials if you have different views. We've got the I was right model, where they essentially start cherry picking and they say, look, certain aspects of this seem to confirm my existing ideas. And the reason we keep assessing, getting to draw things, annotate things, discuss things, describe things, is it becomes hard to lie over time. Eventually you're going to get to the truth of what they believe. And we want that. I mean, that's what makes this interesting. So they, pick aspects of what they've described and create hybrid models and go, what I thought was still true. And this leads me into the mixed model, where the teaching learning happens and they end up with a different model. As I discussed, they understand the tilt of the Earth's axis causing the seasons, but they think that is what causes distance, so they smush their own stuff in there a little bit. This can be part of the developmental process as well. Some ideas and concepts can be too abstract, like the particulate nature of matter can be really hard for a child to understand that the table or desk they're sitting on is composed of atoms and molecules and quarks and things of that nature, because it's abstract. They can't see it. So it feels untrue. That the smoothest surface is likely a mirror for them. No, the desk is quite rough because it is not purely reflective. Like, there's all sorts of little bits and pieces that are so small and abstract for them, they can't quite internalise it. It feels contrary to common sense in a way. And science is part of that as well. Because we just don't have access to everything from our limited perspective as humans. We can't see the colour ultraviolet. Our eyes don't let us see it, but it exists. And then, of course, what we hope to achieve is this one. This is the one I like. This is the shared model. You as the teacher, likely, on average, know a lot more than your students. In some areas, they may know more than you. But across the board, as an adult with higher education training, you are a more sophisticated learner than they are on average across the different disciplines. They may have brilliance, you may foster that brilliance. So they have knowledge, you have knowledge. They have skills that you wish you had. I mean, I'm teaching gifted and talented mathematics students, and their computational skills were brilliant. They could just do it. And here is me having to check by writing things down on my table. I was a plotter. But I still understood the mathematics. I was capable of teaching it to them, but I didn't have their cognitive brilliance for doing it in their heads, doing it in my head like they did. But I could still coach them. Again, the sports metaphor. Coach is usually not that great a player historically, not that gifted, but they can still teach the most gifted players. So the teaching and learning process happens. Yes, the teacher is primarily helping the student. Sometimes it goes the other way as well. And then the learner ends up with what is closer to a scientific, the views of the scientific community. And notice that T has changed to an S. So the teacher is not responsible to turn those students into clones of themselves. They're working together, and in fact, the teacher's probably learning bits and pieces and being reminded of stuff through that process. You've probably found this going through this subject, even preparing your assessments, going, oh, hang on, I never thought about this. You are picking up bits of knowledge through that process. So it's probably moving you as well. So what does it all mean? Well, if there is a conflict between, and they have strongly held beliefs, they don't always have strongly held beliefs or ideas, but let's assume they do. If there's a conflict and there is no difference in the quality of evidence, we as humans default to our pre-existing beliefs. And we do that because it has served us to that point. We do this on a myriad of fronts. So to get them to move beyond a pre-existing belief, we have to provide quality learning experiences that point out little flaws in the thinking respectfully, that give them opportunities to observe this, to investigate, to learn, to reconstruct knowledge and reconstruct beliefs themselves, where they take ownership of it through making models, through doing investigations, through observing what they're seeing. That is how you get them to move to a new belief, not telling them and saying, listen to me, do you get it? It's the reason I tend to show research in these subjects, so they go, that's just this guy, he's a university academic, he doesn't know what he's talking about. If I can go to research evidence, I'm more likely to move you on some of these points. Although many of you probably agree with some of these things I'm saying. Maybe I don't have to deal with this. So the teacher needs to keep probing each student's thinking through assessment. We can't just ask the sort of three kids that want to talk all the time and assume that's working. We've got to get every student sharing something through writing, through speaking, through drawing, whatever you like. But we need to keep probing their thinking throughout the process through assessment. What is seen is influenced by observation and existing ideas. That's why we have the engage phases. That's why we're asking them to use their own language, to give their own ideas. That's why the engage phase exists in the 5 E's, because we want to keep linking what they're seeing with what they've previously said. I mean, I do my best to do that in tutorials when I can. It's not always easy. It depends how I'm going. And that these existing ideas, beliefs and attitudes are all constructions of previous experiences. And so what this leads to is when they produce a summative assessment task, and hopefully we'll see this in this subject through assessments 1 and 2, what you end up with is a product of you as a student, elements of the subject, creating something that is different, new, exciting, that has accurate elements of all these components. And I think that's the essence of learning to me. So we cannot, key takeaways, look, we can't assume what the teacher knows. And this is exactly the same as the scientific community. It's unreasonable to expect that. I wouldn't expect that of myself. I certainly wouldn't expect that of you. But we're going to make the effort to improve. We want that growth mindset. You must always check that you understand the science. And aren't we fortunate that we exist in the world of primary connections and Scoodle and the internet and the CSIRO, because we can always get a bullet point checklist. I can go and Google stuff. I can refresh my memory if it's been a few months, just like you can if it's been a few years since you've taught something as well. We go to good sources ideally, but there's no harm in refreshing information. If we're not using it every day, it goes away. The mental models that our students hold and which we hold have to be identified before learning can take place, or they won't understand what change is taking place. Without any pre-assessment in any form, we don't quite know if they've moved or shifted or how it compares to previous thinking. Learning is a cyclical process, so each cycle leads to greater learning. So that's why the 5 E's starts again, and we talk about the spiral curriculum. You come back to sentence writing again, and spelling again, and mathematics again, and you use them with more sophistication. Same with sports skills. In basketball, you learn to shoot from really close to the hoop without jumping, and then you step back, and then you learn to jump, and then you learn to do it with defenders there, and all those sorts of things. So we keep doing it. It's a cycle. How does this reflect in your teaching? Well, my suggestion, and this is part of a task that we should really look at, is to look at these in line with working scientifically in design and production streams. We've talked about and seen how some of the sophistication there starts to emerge as you go through the stage levels. But I would like you to take a look at that and see how these notions of constructivist teaching, the importance of prior knowledge, the importance of active construction are reflected in the working scientifically in design and production components in the syllabus. They start on page 26 of the syllabus. Again, this is the spiral curriculum. I'm pointing you back to the syllabus. We're going back again and again and again, but with different levels of focus each time. What are the strategies? Well, we'll get into this. We talked a bit about the KWL chart, what I know, want to know, what I've learned, how we can manipulate that idea, what we know, how we know it, what I think I know. We can have different combinations of this. And any idea, any activity that involves students expressing their ideas and thinking. Usually in response to stimulus, like a video that doesn't explain it but shows it, or a story. We don't just want them going, here's a science video that explains it, tell me what's in that video. We want their ideas. They're true ideas. So brainstorming, sentence writing, drawing, interviews, model making, questioning. Look, it's all stuff you've seen, observed. You can bring technology into this as well with things like Padlets if you wish, or Canva, or computer-assisted design stuff. I guess if you wanted to play around with something like Tinkercad, that's up to you as well. I wonder if there's room for AI in the future without giving the game away. We'll play around with this later on, hopefully on Bathurst campus. But we need to know that students do have these alternative conceptions. We prefer the term in this subject, alternative conceptions. Misconceptions applies that wrongness idea. As we talked about, there can be elements of truth and inaccuracy in students' thinking. So we don't want to give it a binary right or wrong idea. I mean, my ideas of science may be right for me as a teacher and an academic in education, but they may be way too simplistic for an academic researching in the science space. So we want to acknowledge that. So that's the term we see in academic literature. We could call them preconceptions. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. There's a few websites to help you with some of these ideas as well here. These are more general publications. We'll get into academic articles in this space more in later on in the second half of the semester for assessment 2. So, we will come back to this and look at things like Google Scholar and stuff like that. But here's some strategies around the do's and don'ts of alternative conceptions. We talked a bit about this as well. Assess and build on preconceptions. So we want to build on things they do know and they can appreciate. There are some do's and don'ts here. Obviously, we want to bridge examples, model-based reasoning, diverse instruction. We've talked a bit about this as well. But we see the don'ts, lectures, hands-on, labs. So there has to be communication in all of this. They have to be saying stuff, writing stuff, doing stuff. They can't just be touching stuff or watching stuff, to summarise this. There's some nice ideas here about metacognition. So taking your thought process as an adult and making this explicit for the learner. I'm unsure about this thing. I could look it up this way, but I'm not sure if that's a good sort. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do here. So have a look at this. Part of this is providing activities to produce cognitive conflict. So little debate activities and things of that nature. You can use case study examples. We often see this in more complex things when it comes to, say, energy production. You can look at claims made in the political space, the public space, and compare and contrast those to what's in the academic literature and the CSIRO, and see where things stand up, where the truth may lie across different domains. Here are a few examples of different ideas in different disciplines that just give you a sense of the kinds of ideas that might be out there. So you can't comment on these are misconceptions that electrons flow at the speed of light. Not quite true. Electricity is made of electrons, but it's more a result of the free movement of electrons. That the flow is like water and it doesn't occur all at once. That sort of stuff. It's actually a bike chain's the best model to show students this. The flow of water is not accurate because, like a bike chain, when it starts moving, they all move simultaneously, just instantly. That's how it works. So a few things to look at there, and there are some common alternative conceptions you can look at here. Obviously, you in a classroom setting would get the ideas, beliefs from your own students, but it can't help. It can help to get a sense of the type of things that students are walking around not understanding. We do get misunderstanding things like the sun not being a star, because stars seem to be really small and twinkly. The sun's massive, and it's during the day. The sun disappears at night. The sun will never burn out. And this is a good one because in our lives it's not going to, but it will eventually. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that students are not likely to know here as well, that meteors are falling stars. We can understand that sort of romanticised notion of it. Gravity increases with height. No, the gravitational force remains the same, but the damage that's caused, with human weight or the weight of the thing, is obviously quite high. So there is no increase of it with height. The Earth's revolution around the sun causes day and night. So it's sort of a misattribution, sort of mixing up what causes the seasons with what causes day and night. Of course, day and night is caused by the Earth spinning on its own axis. So we've got lots of movement happening. So check those out. I think this is really helpful because it's not written in dense academic jargon, and I do apologise. I tend towards that. It is my job. But there's lots of really interesting alternative conceptions here. Heating air only makes it hotter. Pressure and force are synonyms. Lots of language stuff as well. And that's why the 5 E's really emphasises that sort of transition from student language in the explore, engage, explore phases into the consolidation of science language in around the explain, elaborate, evaluate phases. So you can see how all these sort of seemingly disparate things that I'm talking about in these lectures do kind of connect together. It all sort of flows together into the student-centered vision of the world. But anyway, we'll move on beyond those. So these are a little activity. If you get the chance, bring some activities that you might do in your lesson plans to tutorials to test out. We can provide some resources if you need be. Just contact your tutors. The reason you would do that is, of course, to understand them better, to produce a better quality lesson plan, but also to create resources that would be marked quite highly. If you create your own resources, pictures, examples, whatever it may be, worksheets, you tend to get better marks. Actually, you just do get better marks. It's in the rubric, but save that for week 6. We want to be focusing on the working scientifically in design and production strands in this. So, going through those phases of scientific investigation and product design, if appropriate. You don't need to do both. Most will probably do working scientifically. Some may also do design and production sort of focus areas as well. You will have to have some background knowledge. So there's a bit of background knowledge research here. What is the science that underpins this? That can be incorporated into your Assessment 1 Part B as well. So hopefully we can start breaking off and exploring different ideas. Again, there's a lot of agency in the tutorials, so defer to your tutor in the first instance. In terms of weekly preparation here, we want to start moving ahead into teaching and learning strategies for the modules. So these, I'll be covering these more next week, but 2.7 through 2.11 in the module if you'd like to. Again, defer to what your group is asking of you and then your tutor. So again, we start with those closest to you, your group members, your tutor, and then me as the lowest priority. Bring your laptops and tablets to class. And get ready to trial some activities and use those to create resources and examples to enrich your lesson plans, to get better marks, because why wouldn't you? But anyway, that's it for the week 4 lecture. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back with the week 5 lecture.